Hello! It's the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another Canada federal election forecast. Now, before I begin, I want to shout out my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel, and if you guys want to support the work I do here, by all means, go down and link in the description below and press that join button. Otherwise, if you don't want to do that, you can just do your regular YouTube things like share, subscribe, comment below, or you could even drop a super thanks. But with that, let us get to the video. So we were just leaving the first week of the election at the time of recording this. It is Friday the 28th. And over this week, I would say, but perhaps conservatively, I think Poilievre overall had a good week, but so did Carney. Now, Carney had some missteps, but overall his poll numbers did really well. So you can't really say he had a bad week per se. Now, it might portend weakness coming in the future, which remains to be seen. But overall, the two main party leaders had a quote-unquote good week. And you might think to yourself, how can I say Poilievre had a good week? My last forecast had the Conservatives winning a minority, and now they're losing. Well, it just turns out that the fundamental math here is that if the NDP's vote is collapsing and coalescing behind the Liberals, it's very difficult for the Conservatives to be in front. It's not impossible. In fact, I still think Poilievre can potentially still win this election. He only needs to claw back 1 or 2 points from the Liberals, or the NDP might need to claw back 1 or 2 points. And it's far too soon to even really say anything robustly. But the big interest here is basically the election is shaping up exactly as expected. In my first video on the first day of the election, the election is boiling down to: is Trump the main issue, or is the last 9 years of incompetence in Canada been the issue? There's not a better term for this. The last 9 years of Liberal government did not go well. There's all sorts of crises across the country. Productivity is flat. Healthcare is a disaster. Housing is a disaster. You can point to whatever you want, but the objective truth is the last 9 years, 10 years of Liberal government haven't been good. And the question is, if it's about that performance, the Liberals lose. Polls are very, very clear on this. If it's about Trump, the Liberals win. And the question here, and the framing here, and the discussion here for the rest of the election is going to be those two parties trying to fight this out. And that's why you're seeing the Greens, the People's Party, the NDP collapse, because they do not have any answer to either of those questions. Singh, most poignantly, is an empty suit. He's a useless politician. He stands for nothing. He cares about only himself. He has no stance on Trump that matters. He will call Trump mean names, but when it comes down to it, when Canadians see this foreign threat from Trump, and if they consider that to be the preeminent issue, they're going to rally behind Carney, because Carney is calm, cool, stern. Jake Meat is a preening, foppish fool. He doesn't look the part of someone who is going to stand up to someone. He's too melodramatic. And at the same time, all Singh is talking about is things like the grocery stores price gouging you when their profit margins are flat. The price gouging of they're not making more money on average than they did before on average. Huzzah. So Singh's out. And as we see here, with 0 seats projected for the NDP might die. If they genuinely get 0 seats, the party will never be a major force federally again. Now, it's potentially possible in my forecast, and in any other forecast model that you see, 338 or anyone else, the NDP might overperform this just because what we saw in the 2025 Ontario election, the NDP doesn't lose votes uniformly. So it could very well be that, say, in Central Nova, the NDP is nearly 0%. But in places like Halifax, they might be still 20, 30%. So it could very well be things like that, where the NDP's vote losses are completely inconsistent. It's not smooth across the country. I've tried to model this a little bit, but it's hard because there's too many unknowns. So I'm fully prepared that the NDP might do better than 0 seats. That could be a bad projection. I'm pretty confident in that vote share number, though, of 9%. And that vote share number is likely going to keep falling if polls continue to trend the way they're trending. Which is bad for the NDP, suffice it to say. Now, for the two main parties, the ones that actually matter and the ones who are actually doing things in this election, what we're really seeing with the Conservatives is there's a huge movement, particularly from Ontario-based, Doug Ford-aligned Conservatives, that they really want Poilievre to go really hard into Trump. Now, there is a difference between Poilievre saying, like, Trump's bad for attacking Canada on trade, or we need to stand up to Trump on trade. That's one thing. But a lot of these guys want Poilievre to shift that to be the entire focus of the campaign, that his campaign is about fighting Trump. Whereas Poilievre thus far has been, basically, his campaign is running as, we are weak to Trump because the last 9 years have been bad. That is pitched to voters. That we can't stand up to Trump with this government because this government keeps failing on every portfolio. Now, there's big push from the Doug Ford adjacent camp. I think would be a disastrous position from Poilievre. Like, do not get me wrong. I'm not saying he should be pro-Trump. That'd be ridiculous. I'm not saying he should be soft on Trump. Equally ridiculous. But the focus of his campaign cannot be on Trump. It has to be on how the Liberals have done a bad job. And the reason for this, the polling is very, very, very clear. Voters, if it's about cost of living, if it's about the economy, if it's about housing, or it's about immigration, the Conservatives are the overwhelming favorite of the electorate. It's just the issue of Trump that puts the Liberals ahead. And specifically just that with old people. 50, especially 65 plus demo old people. So the most elderly, if you will, the boomers. And that demographic is it's not very fluid. It's going to be very, very difficult to change the minds of someone in their 70s about how they want to vote. It's not impossible. I'm not saying you should never try to change the mind of a 70-year-old, but it's a lot harder to change their mind than it is to change the mind of a 20-year-old or a 40-year-old. It's just fundamentally a lot harder. And the issues for a 70-year-old are not issues that the Conservatives are usually very well have a very good brand recognition on, or very good trust on. For example, most voters, for better or worse, do not trust the Conservatives on healthcare as much. In this particular cycle, their deficit on healthcare is not very large. They're about neck and neck with the Liberals. But then you compare that to polls that have the Conservatives like 20 or 30 points better on the economy, and you can really see the difference here. Similarly, a lot of old age pension reform stuff, there's a perception, which the party is probably was very clear that he's not doing this, but there is a perception that the Conservatives are going to muck around with pension systems, and that's just, again, you can always speculate that the party is lying to you and is going to do something it's said it's not going to do, but based on public statements, he's not going to do it. But a lot of people still believe he will. And that makes it really hard to the pensioner crowd, because I think he's going to touch their pensions in a way that hurts them. But if he's talking about things like immigration, housing, the economy, all that stuff. The election is now about things that conservatives are strongest on. And the way you make this relevant into this moment, because people have said before to me, okay, but people are concerned about Trump, what are you going to do? You have to loop this back in with what people are worried about. You have to link why the economy being bad has made us weak to Trump. For example, for the conservatives, they have to link in, like, for example, the fact that we don't have an east-west pipeline in Canada means we can't export our oil to anyone else but the U.S. And that is one of our major export products to the U.S. And it means places like Ontario and Quebec are at the mercy of the U.S. in a trade war for their energy supplies outside of electricity that's produced by hydronuclear, because the current pipeline that goes from Alberta to Ontario, Enbridge Line 5, runs through the U.S. They can shut it down. It would hurt the U.S., don't get me wrong, but it would also really hurt Ontario. Or if there's tariffs on the border, that would increase the cost of oil to Ontario, which would be disastrous for a lot of Ontario-based manufacturing. You could link things like that, and that's really the path to a conservative victory. Now, we'll probably be able to pull that off. Hard to say. But if he can't pull that off, he can't win. Similarly, Carney, his play here is to try to keep focus on Trump and to keep focus on away from the current state of Canada, the current economy of Canada, the current housing issues, the immigration issues. He can quietly try to address some of those issues, like he's done with suspending the consumer carbon tax. He can quietly try to do stuff like squashing the capital gains changes. Trudeau quietly-ish. He publicly announced it, but I don't think it was that well picked up by average Joes. Change immigration rules again. Tighten it up, especially temporary migrants, but even permanent residents were tightened quite significantly. But that will take time. And it's hard to really say if that will be high yield during the election. Now, it could be, but I think it'll be very difficult to see that. So Carney's position, despite it looking really good now, and at this moment in time of recording, it might be even better next week when I do my next update, because the momentum is currently in Carney's camp. Now, my model, I know people have complained before. First off, I don't care. You can complain all you want about my model. I'm not going to change it in this regard. My model, especially early elections, especially between elections, has a very low recency bias. That is on purpose. That's not a bug. That is purposeful. I also do lots of other calculations based on historical vote patterns, based on incumbency bias, based on forecast strategic voting, based on forecasted poll misses, etc., etc. All of these things increase popular vote accuracy. And for the most part, seat accuracy. Sometimes I make mistakes, but for the most part, seat accuracy gets better from these. Popular vote accuracy gets better. I'm usually very, very good at forecasting the popular vote, if nothing else. So it's not going to change. And this is going to mean that my model is going to lag polls in some circumstances until very, very close to election day. So yeah, Carney's probably going to get better in the next update, but it might not. We'll see how next week's polls go, but it could be better next week for Carney. It is what it is. It could be worse. Now, that's really what this election boils down to. It's this interplay between these two parties and them dueling over the main issue. The trick here and the big concern here for Carney is some of the polls are already starting to show his approval slipping. As people get to know him, they're not as enthused about him. Because a lot of the impressions he had in early March 10th to the 17th, for example, were people thinking he is who they thought he was. Because almost no one knew who Carney was in, say, 2022. Only the most hardcore Canadian political nerds would know who Mark Carney was in 2022, 2023. 2024, some people might have heard about him. But by now, obviously, people are getting to know him. And as they get to know him, they realize, oh, this isn't X, he's Y. Now, this might not necessarily be him lying to people. A lot of people will forecast to a leader. They will inscribe upon them what they want. And then they realize very quickly, oh wait, that person isn't like this. And that when that happens, you see their points slip. Now, over time, they might recover again, or they might keep slipping. We saw this with Poilievre in 2022, September, when he was the first elected leader of the Conservative Party. The polls shot up for a month. His approval shot up for a month. Then by October, they have started falling. They leveled out in November. And then he started slowly increasing again from there, as people's impressions evened out and his messaging and rhetoric started to win people over. And that's how this is going to go. It's very, very, very likely, all else being equal, Carney will slip for no fault of his own because people misevaluated him before they knew anything about him. And that honeymoon period, when that's over, will slip for Carney. Will that be apparent next week in the polls? I'm not 100% sure. I do think it will be apparent by April 10th. Now, that said, this is all else being equal. If Poilievre suddenly really flops campaigning, or Singh just does a disastrous whatever, or the debates go really well for Carney, that will obviously change these things. But if none of those things happen, Poilievre is normal, Singh is normal, the debates are normal, you would expect Carney to slip from his peak. Is his peak right now? Will his peak be sometime next week? I don't know. But it will be soon, I think. It might be my next update, because of my fact that my model is going to lag polls on purpose right now. When it gets to the final week, it will not lag polls anymore, because I'll have the recency bias really, really, really high. But right now, it lags polls on purpose, because I keep the recency bias relatively low. And in case you're curious, if I put the recency bias as high as possible, it would basically just mean that only the last polls, or all the polls on the last day would matter. So you don't want to have it too high, because you still want to consider the other polls. But I digress. So I won't say, and I won't claim this, that Carney's peaked here, but he is probably very, very close to it. And if we go look at the numbers across the board, you can kind of see, I think, the relationship here. So if we go back and we look at March 3rd. March 3rd is where I think the neutral point, give or take, for Carney is. And when I say that, I mean ignoring campaigning, ignoring the Trump issue. This is where I think Carney will fall down to in the long term. Now, he might come up with a lot of policies that reinvigorate people. He might not. But I think what we're seeing right now is because of the Trump stuff. Now, you will note in previous videos I said this was the Trump bump, but I'm saying a slightly different thing. That video is not wrong. My commentary there is not wrong. I'm making a slightly different point here. The point, a lot of the momentum Carney has right now at 40% is coming from the NDP, the Greens, the Bloc losing support. The Bloc's lost about a point. The Greens have lost about a point. The NDP's lost about 5. That's 7 points. 7 of these points are from these smaller left-wing parties, in the case of the Bloc, a separatist party, losing support. It could be the case that this support never recovers. And if that's so, Carney probably wins. But it's very likely that this support does recover. to some fashion. It seems very unlikely to me that the NDP will actually get 0 seats, or they will actually be at 9%. It could happen. I will not discount the possibility that the polls are correct. But it would be very remarkable. I think over the next month we will see some of this return. Some of this revive as people realize, especially NDPers, that Carney, in the way he's acting at this moment, in the way he's campaigning, is not particularly campaigning as a left-winger. Regardless of what he said in the past, regardless of the vibes of Carney, at this moment, in the year of our Lord, 2025, he's campaigning like a blue lib. He's not campaigning like an orange lib. He's campaigning to Trudeau's right. Will he govern to Trudeau's right? Remains to be seen. But he is campaigning like it. And I think unless Trump keeps forcing himself into the forefront, which is, again, a non-zero possibility, we will see this return. And you will see slipping. And you'll probably see slipping most poignantly in BC, Ontario, and the Maritimes. And the reason I say this, specifically, those 3 regions, is BC is the strongest place for the NDP. Ontario has a lot of very specific NDP or bust areas with very strong long-term incumbents, places like London Fanshawe, places like Hamilton Centre, some spots in the north where there's a really strong local support and various Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario with the NDP, as well as blue-collar guys in their towns. Though they're losing those over time, but they still have base there. In a similar story, but different, in the Maritimes, the NDP is not doing well here in any way, shape, or form. But if you look at specifically Nova Scotia, it seems very unlikely to me that in my home of Nova Scotia that the NDP will dramatically underperform the provincial party. They might underperform a bit. Even 10, 20,000 votes underperform. But unless turnout is farcically high here, which I'm not expecting, it seems very unlikely they'll get 12%. I could see them more likely to get something like 18 or even 16%. And you start clawing back some of these percentages for Carney, and it looks very difficult. Especially if the Conservatives do rebound a little bit in these polls. Though even then it's not very necessary, because again, we go back even to this with the Carney down 5 points. You have a Conservative minority. And if you lose more, it's a majority. And that's the kind of situation here. It's not impossible, do not get me wrong. Carney can absolutely hold this together if the cards are played correctly. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to unify disparate parties who don't like each other in voter bases who are not very well aligned. In the case of the Bloc voter base, they're separatists, or they're at least separatist adjacent, voting for a very strong Federalist Party. Now, there's reasons for that. It's not completely irrational. A lot of these voters realize that separating when Trump is here is dangerous. And they don't want to do that. But that is kind of the deal. So that is the big risk for Carney, is a lot of his lead is built on very shaky, very quickly built foundations. Maybe it will hold. But that's not a guarantee. And anyone who treats that like a guarantee over the next 28 days, or whatever, that's technically like 31 or something like that, is lying to you. There is a very distinct possibility that Carney can't hold that together because his coalition only exists because of an external threat. Maybe that external threat stays salient enough and stays concerning enough for a month that voters will rally. But like all things, people fatigue on things. by April 28th, the Trump stuff will be a 5-month-old story. It was November 2024 when he started talking about annexing Canada. April 28th is, 6 months later. 6 months. It'll be 3 months since Trump was elected, took office and started doing things. Is that enough time for people to get fatigued on the issue and start refocusing on local stuff? I don't know. But eventually it will happen. If we go, let's say, hypothetically, we have this minority. And then Carney decides, let's have a snap election in 2027 to try to capitalize on Trump before he gets reelected. Because Trump, for the last 2 years, has been belligerent, threatening annexation, threatening tariffs. Well, certainly by then, if nothing has happened other than putting on a tariff, or putting on a tariff and taking it off the next day, if nothing else has happened other than that, people will be fatigued of the story. They'll stop caring, they'll stop tuning in, and it will not be the major issue for voters. Unless you poo me and say, well, people will care, Bagel. What are you talking about? I point you to the Ukraine-Russia war. That was salient. The main issue on everyone's minds, everyone I knew in real life was talking about that every single day, was refreshing things like the ISW's website every single day for updates for a few months. Then sometime in late 2022, early 2023, it got stale. The war stopped being dramatic. We were stuck in a stalemate in Ukraine. And that no longer held people's interests and people's fascinations, and other issues in their life started boiling forward, and people now can go, and by 2025 or now, people barely remember it. That was 3 years ago. The idea that an issue, even an existential threat, or Russia invading Ukraine is not existential to Canada, but even a major cataclysmic thing like a war where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are dying, can't hold attention. Slapping tariffs on and then removing tariffs a couple days later, like Trump's been doing so far, won't hold attention for years. Months, perhaps. Years, no. So the question really here is, how long are voters' attention stuck on this? And there's also the concern, too, of a feedback loop and a incorrect feedback loop. It's an issue you kind of have with issue polling, especially if you bundle it with federal polls, where if you ask issues before you ask the polling question, you can get response bias. You have to ask your polling question, then you ask issue questions, or else you will color their vote choice response. And that's not a good thing. It'll make your poll inaccurate. Now, most pollsters in Canada are good enough to not do this, but if pollsters and the media is constantly pushing this to front of mind, but it's not actually a front of mind issue, you can get kind of a response bias as well from that. Now, is it? I can't tell you. My normal methods of vibe checking this is to just be in public and listen to what other people are saying. Friends, family, strangers, excuse me, people at my local church, like all that stuff, right? And it's mixed. Some people are continually talking about it. Others aren't. But then you have another issue too, and this is where the vibe check doesn't work super well, is not everyone who speaks talks about things. Who cares about things talks about it publicly. Or not everyone who talks about things actually votes. If you've noticed in the past, we do not have 100% turnout in Canada. I don't think we ever did or ever will. I don't think Australia has 100% turnout, and I'm pretty sure it's legally required to vote in Australia. So that's the trick here for Carney. He has to try to keep an issue that's fundamentally outside of his control the salient issue in people's minds. Maybe Donald Trump will do Carney a solid and will keep that as a front-of-mind issue to people. But maybe they won't. We don't know. And meanwhile, the only winning play I see for Poilievre, again, is to try to change the issue. Try to bring something else front of mind. Because if voters perceive Trump as the most salient, the most critical, most important issue, it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to displace an incumbent government during a foreign policy crisis. Very difficult, if not impossible. Anyone suggesting trying to switch to that, I think, is fundamentally misguided. They might be well motivated, perhaps, but misguided. You just are not going to beat the incumbent government on a foreign policy issue when it's considered that important to people. It's very, very, very difficult. There's a reason why there's the adage of start a war, win re-election. But that all said, and I'll wrap this up here, I don't think Carney's in a good position. The polls say he's in a good position, but I think that is overplaying the cards. Carney's position isn't built on years of campaigning, building up support, building up base, messaging. It's based on an external threat, and that external threat could go away at any moment. Trump could just shut up for a month, and that would undermine Carney's campaign. Now, on the flip side, Trump could actively, if you will, sink Poilievre's campaign. He could just decide to just keep doing things. And there's really nothing Poilievre can do about that. Which makes this election kind of finicky, as not just a projector or modeler, but as a campaigner. You would have a very difficult time dealing with this because you have a known unknown with what is Trump going to do and how people are going to react to it. But I'll leave with this. Even in this scenario, Carney likely would form a minority government, but it's not guaranteed. Blanchet holds the balance of power. He could make sure either of these men is prime minister. So after the election, you would have a very strong negotiating period between the bloc and whoever else. And expect, if this were to happen, the Conservatives might get still a minority government. Because a lot of the biggest issues for the bloc, such as immigration, I don't think Carney, based on his statements he has said since running for a leadership race, where he wants to return to the 2019 average or trend for immigration, I don't think the bloc will accept that. Maybe the bloc will just abstain and let what the Liberals form by default. But maybe the bloc in Blanchet will instead choose to pick a government that will agree to cut immigration substantially, particularly to Quebec, because his provincial counterpart, Plamondon, wants immigration cut down to 35,000 cap in Quebec. If you average that nationally, that would be just 140,000 permanent residents. Trudeau's current policy is 400,000. That is a substantial difference, and I suspect that might color Blanchette's choice. But he is his own man. Who knows how he will vote? Maybe he'll decide to just put up a abstention. Let the Anglos decide what they want to do. But with that, I bid you guys adieu, and I will see you next week, probably with more Canada stuff.